Hello, welcome back. This is the first lecture on chapters 1 and 2 of the literature book. I'm your professor, Mark Schmidt. I'm going to do my best to walk us all through this and try to situate this in some context so it makes some sense. All right, so we're starting with the reading a story chapter, which is chapter 1, page 5. The first term that we see is fiction, right? From the Latin fictio, which means shaping or counterfeiting. The name for stories that are not entirely factual, but partially made up. So, this is what we're studying in Comp 2. We're studying fiction, right? Stories that are partially or wholly fabricated or made up. You could have a story that is 95% historically true and 5% made up. It's fiction. If it's at all in any way, shape, or form made up, it's fiction. So, something like Saving Private Ryan, for instance, right? It's got a lot of factual elements in it. World War II really happened. France is really a country. You know, this was something that really the U.S. does. If you're the last surviving member of a family, you can't fight in war. But whether or not the characters in the story are the historically accurate characters, their names were changed, their dialogue was changed, that makes it fiction, right? We'll talk about historical fiction later on, but the first thing we have to get clear is that our work in Comp 2 is with fiction, right? Narratives that are wholly or completely fabricated. All right. We move on page 6 into different types of short fiction. So we have to get a handle on these different kinds of short fiction. We've got the fable, the parable, and the tale. All right, 3 kinds of short fiction. The first, the fable. Let's do this. We will compare and contrast the fable and the parable first, because that, I think, is the best way to do it. So, the fable, first of all, is recognized by the types of characters and by the moral, as is the parable, but they're different. So, the fable has characters that are personified animals, or they are personified forces of nature. So you've got in fables animals that speak to each other and make bets and do all kinds of stuff, right? They're very human. They're personified animals, right? That's the dramatis personae, the cast of characters of the fable. Personified animals or personified forces of nature, right? The moral of the fable, very cut and dried, very straightforward, very clear cut. This is why fables are so useful for teaching children. Children love animals, especially animals that talk. And the moral is very straightforward. You don't have to worry about, well, what about this? What about that? What if this? What if that happens? It's very straightforward, right? Like the tortoise and the hare. The tortoise is very slow. The hare is very fast. But the tortoise works diligently toward his or her end, right? The hare is very arrogant, believes that he or she is just naturally talented and, of course, will win, doesn't take it seriously, and ends up losing, right? So, the moral. It's better to be somebody or something that works hard, that is diligent, that moves slowly towards a goal, rather than being gifted with some kind of ability, because that makes you lazy. It comes easy and you don't respect it, right? So, the moral of the tortoise and the hare. Hard work and slow incremental work towards a goal triumphs over someone or something with natural ability that doesn't respect it and just believes that he or she deserves it, right? So work hard and move slowly towards your goals is what Aesop is telling us. Most fables, their final line, they'll have a line that says moral and a dash, and it'll say, it'll state the moral. So they're very clear cut, right? Very clear cut morals. Parables, by contrast, have human characters, first of all, and secondly, the morals are much more ambiguous. You really need to interpret the moral of a fable. It's not self-evident what the moral of... Sorry, I misspoke. I said a fable. What the moral of a parable is. They're very easy to confuse. They look very similar. So, parables have human characters. They have morals that need to be interpreted. Right? They're not straightforward. They're not self-evident. You've got this this parable by Chang Tzu, Independence. When you read this, you ask yourself, well, what's the moral, right? Page 11. Maybe the moral is that a quiet life is okay, you know? Maybe the moral is follow your gut, follow your instinct. Maybe the moral is government is dangerous, you know? I mean, there are... If we were in class, I would ask 4 or 5 students what you believe the moral of this parable is, and I would get 5 or 6 different answers. That's emblematic of the parable, right? The parable has to be interpreted. We will often arrive at very different interpretations. So let's recap. The fable. Characters are personified animals or personified forces of nature. The moral, very straightforward, very clear. The parable, on the other hand, the characters are humans, and the moral is much more ambiguous and really needs to be interpreted, okay? I cut my finger. I'm okay, though, so that's what that is. Let's see. Finally, the tale, the third type. The tale really differs from the fable and the parable because the tale is not told to illustrate a moral. It's told to tell a good story, right? Tell an interesting story. It's not really a moral... The moral level is not so important in a tale. It's just to relate these marvelous things, these amazing, wonderful things, and keep people interested, right? So the tale really, the moral level really isn't there. We've got 2 types of tales. The tall tale, which is the tale that recounts the deeds of a superhero, or I prefer a folk hero, like Paul Bunyan or John Henry, the African-American railway worker who was of immense strength, never tired out, a retelling of the Hercules narrative, of course. Then we've got the fairy tale. The fairy tale, the important thing really about the fairy tale is that it's set in this magical world. It's not a realistic world that the fairy tale is set in. It's a world of magic and enchantment or something, right, as they say. Okay, so we've got that. Now, page 14 in reading the story takes a little turn and starts to lay down this foundational terminology that we have to talk about. So the point of this is that we have to share a vocabulary. We can't have some people calling this thing one thing and some other people calling it this. It's so hard to communicate like that. So we have to lay down a terminology that we share, right? We're starting with the term plot. So the plot is the arrangement of events, the artistic arrangement of the events, what happens, and in what order do the things happen. The plot really doesn't have anything to do with meaning. It doesn't... When you summarize the plot, you don't get into the meaning of things. You just say, well, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then it ends. That's how you know you're writing a paper that is just summarizing the plot, which we are not doing. Please don't write papers that just summarize the plot, right? You have to talk about the significance of things. The plot doesn't get into the significance. It just tells us what happens, okay? So the plot is the artistic arrangement of events. When we talk about the main characters in stories, a lot of times we're tempted to call them heroes, but this term means something else, which we'll talk about later. But for our purposes, we are calling the main character in a story the protagonist. Okay, so the protagonist, like the word progress, for instance, the protagonist moves the story forward, right? Moves the story in a progressive or forward manner. The antagonist opposes the protagonist and wants to stop the protagonist and also, therefore, stop the story, right? So the antagonist is trying to stop the protagonists and the story's forward movement. They don't have anything to do with really who's good and who's bad. Protagonist doesn't have really any moral to it, any moral judgment, which is why I think it's a good terminology, because you might consider a certain character to be a hero that I might think is a villain, right? So now we don't know who we're talking about, right? We're talking about the same person using different terms. The main character is the protagonist, right? The character or force that opposes the protagonist is the antagonist. So it's a terminology that doesn't have any moral judgment in it, right? There's no moral consideration there. It's just functional. That's good for us, right? Okay, so this let's call it a tension, right, of the protagonist and antagonist. That's a conflict. In stories, we've got conflicts, right? So the antagonist opposes the protagonist, creates a conflict, right? When that conflict escalates into a moment of higher tension, it becomes a crisis. When that crisis escalates to the moment of highest tension in a story, it becomes the climax, right? We're talking about suspense here, how suspense builds in a story, right? First the conflict, then crisis, then the climax, the highest moment of suspense, right? So if you're a fan of Harry Potter, for instance, the climax of the story really comes in the final movie or book, where it seems like Voldemort has killed Harry. It seems like everything's lost. They find a way around it, it ends up making sense, but in that moment, the viewer is left bereft, feeling like the protagonist has died and failed, and the story's over, right? But we find out that that's not the case, so that's a moment of highest suspense or tension, right? When that suspense or tension resolves, falls, it's called the resolution, or the denouement, which means falling, right? It's also the resolution, the denouement, or the conclusion. All these terms mean the same thing, really, for the end of a story. The beginning of a story is called the exposition. That's where we find out the setting. We find out who the characters are. We learn a little bit about them, right? So it's exposition, then we've got that conflict. The conflict turns into a crisis. The crisis turns into a climax, and then the tension falls into a conclusion or a resolution or a denouement. That's the arc. That's what they call a story arc, right? The arc of suspense in a story. Okay, let's get into these narrative techniques, and we'll talk a little bit about our first short story, A&P. Okay, so the first term we have, the first narrative technique, the way that authors tell stories. We've got in media res, Latin term for something that begins in the middle, means literally in the middle of things. So Pulp Fiction is a good example of a story film that displays what we mean by in media res. We start Pulp Fiction kind of in the middle. Jules and Vince are sitting in the car, they're about to go do this robbery. Things have already happened that we don't know about yet, right? So we start the story in the middle. That's in media res. We don't start at the beginning, which would be like maybe Vince or Jules' birth, watching those characters grow up, turn to a life of crime, blah blah blah. We don't see that. Instead, we start in the middle of the story. The viewer has to piece together the rest. In media res, a story that starts in the middle, literally means in the middle of things. Flashback. Flashback is an important term, and we have to be really careful about how we think about flashback. And I think when we get into the narrator, the point of view section, you'll see why flashback is kind of important. But the flashback is a moment that's relived in a character's memory, right? It's important that you don't think of the flashback as a moment when the story moves backwards in time, because stories that are realist, right, that obey the physical laws of the universe we inhabit, stories that are realist don't go backwards in time. It's not Back to the Future, right? The flashback is when a character or the narrator is remembering something, right? So don't think of a flashback as like, oh, well, it was 1980, now it's 1976. It's not really that. It's a character remembering what was going on, and we're privy to it because of the kind of narrator, which we'll see, all right? All right, we've got the flashback. Foreshadowing. I think we're probably familiar with foreshadowing. Foreshadowing happens when we're given little clues, like little narrative hints, little breadcrumbs about what will happen later, right? So that is foreshadowing. On page 16, we've got some terminology that relates to the short story, because that's where, we've gone from the short fiction, the fable, the parable, the tale. Now we're into the short story, right? Those are the roots that the short story grows from. Okay, so short stories tend to be short, right? They don't have time to get into all kinds of different subplots and tell us a whole lot about our characters. So often in a short story, you'll be presented with a few scenes. And they're usually very terse, very short. You don't get a good sense of the characters. You don't really get a good sense of the setting really well. But the point gets across, okay? So short stories are usually compiled of a few scenes. They rely heavily on summary rather than watching the scene unfold. If you were in my Comp 1 class, we talked about scene versus summary when doing narrative, right? The scene method is much more detailed. The summary method is about recapping or paraphrasing. So in a short story, you might only have room for one or two scenes, right? And then the rest of the short story is summary, right? Which situates everything, okay? Often in short stories, we see a character who undergoes some kind of epiphany, right? An epiphany is some moment of insight or revelation, a moment when a character realizes something. We'll talk about Sammy a little bit in A&P. Sammy realizes that the world doesn't work the way he thinks it does, and that he's not really being heroic like he thinks he is. But we'll talk about that in a second. Short stories, some of the ones that we'll talk about, in the class and later on, will be called stories of initiation, right? So a story of initiation is usually a story of a character moving into adulthood or into a different kind or mode of life, right? So think about an initiation, right? When you're initiated, into the mafia, right? You're part of it now. Your life has changed. It's fundamentally different. You can't be like, oh, this was really a bad idea. I don't think I really want to do this. You can't say, well, I really don't want to become an adult. I'm just going to stay a kid. It doesn't work that way, right? You go through different phases of life. The story of initiation is the movement into adulthood or into a different phase of life, okay? All right, so that's the Chapter 1 terminology. I'm going to talk real briefly about A&P because we're going to talk about it on our call, but a lot of you probably read A&P by John Updike and thought this is a story that's not about anything, right? It's just a kid working in a grocery store who sees these girls, stands up for them, and then boom, it's over. What's the point, right? This is the feeling you'll get from a lot of the short stories we read because they are so short. You don't have a lot of time to get to know the characters. You might ask yourself what the point or purpose is, but I think if we talk about A&P, I'm just going to talk about it briefly. We could talk more on the call, but A&P by John Updike is really about kind of realizing that you're doing things for the wrong reason. Sammy sees these girls who are scantily clad and come into his store that he's the cashier at. He doesn't really like his boss, his manager. He's very young. He doesn't really need this job. He doesn't really like it. But the manager starts being kind of aggressive and a little rude to these three young women who come in because they're not wearing, the quote-unquote proper clothing. And Sammy's reaction is to quit. He basically tells off the manager and he quits. And he thinks that's a very heroic gesture, that he has he has suffered and sacrificed for these women, these young women, so that they're not, talked down to and disrespected by this mean manager. But I think as we see in the end, right, in the last bit, when, this is really telling, on page 21, I look around for my girls, but they're gone, right? Sammy thinks that because he's stuck up for these young women, they in some way owe him something, and they have in some way become his, right? Very objectifying. Let's not forget that he works in a grocery store. He calls the one young lady's rear end a can at one moment. he's like turning them into any other object in a supermarket, right? They are just things to be possessed by men. And Sammy believes, since he stood up for these young ladies, that they now are his, right? I look around for my girls, but they're gone, of course. There wasn't anybody but some young married screaming at her children, blah, blah, blah. Looking back at the big windows and the bags of peat moss and blah, blah, blah. I could see Langle in my place. His face was dark and gray and his back stiff. He had gotten an injection of iron. My stomach kind of fell as I felt how hard the world was going to be to me hereafter. So this is an epiphany. This is a moment of realization and also a story of initiation, right? He is dealing in a world the rules of which he doesn't really know like he thinks he does. He thinks that standing up for these girls means they're going to be out there like, oh, thank you, you're our hero, you fought off that mean manager and now we owe you something and now we're yours, and he like some object or some kind of food in a store or something, and he realizes that that's not the way the real world works. Okay, so a little bit about why A&P is an important story. We could talk more about that. I think it's a really important topic that we should discuss, especially now in the modern moment where we have conversations about gender, about the objectification of women, about the Me Too movement and such. Like this is what John Updike is talking about here, right? How women are turned into objects that men feel they own and possess. So a little bit about patriarchy. Okay, let's move on. You'll notice that at the end of each chapter, you've got some summary and some questions. You don't need to answer any of the questions. They're just there for you to read. You don't have to write anything. All right, so the second chapter we've got is the point of view chapter. Whenever you hear point of view, you're talking about narrators. Okay, so you really have to understand what a narrator is, because without understanding a narrator, you won't understand anything that we do in this class. The most important thing, I think, is that you have to differentiate between the author and the narrator, okay? So if William Faulkner writes a short story, blah, 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 it's not William Faulkner speaking. It's a narrator, right? The narrator is an imagined character who tells a story. It's not Faulkner telling you A Rose for Emily. It's not Faulkner sitting there, like, narrating this thing. It's, interestingly, an entity that calls itself we. It's like the voice of the town or something. It's a plural thing. It's like a communal consciousness or something. Faulkner does very weird things with narrators. That's why there's a Faulkner story in the narrator section. Okay, so the narrator is the fictional character who tells a story. It's not the author. Okay. Let's see. A lot of this chapter, I'm really not super concerned that you completely understand, so I'm just going to point to a few moments that I think are important. Something that is important is being able to tell the difference between a participant and a non-participant narrator, okay? A non-participant narrator is not a character in the story. A participant narrator is. So, in Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, right? The unnamed brother is a participant narrator. He's narrating the story, but he also is a character in the story, so he participates, right? It's pretty straightforward. The kinds of narrators. The most important for our purposes, and the one I really need you to understand, is really the omniscient narrator. Most of the narrators we're going to see are omniscient narrators. I'm not really concerned if you know the difference between like limited omniscience or editorial omniscience or impartial omniscience. It's a little beyond what we're trying to accomplish. So the point, the omniscient narrator is an all-knowing narrator. The omniscient narrator knows all the details of the story, but this is the important thing. The omniscient narrator can also go inside the mind of any character. That's so misunderstood and not understood. That's why that was important to connect to the flashback bit, right? The omniscient narrator goes inside a character's mind and shows us an earlier moment in time. the time doesn't go backwards. We're not really in an earlier moment. The narrator can go into the character's mind and show us what the character's thinking, right? You'll see this a lot. We'll talk about it a lot. So if some of these things are not completely clear to you the first time I say them and you read them, that's all right. This is confusing and this is complicated. It's going to take a while for us to get up to speed. So like, don't feel overwhelmed or like, I listened to the lecture and I didn't completely understand every single term. That's all right. You know, it's progress, not perfection. All right. Another important, or two more important things about the narrative, the narrators, the narrative points of view. You've got. We often tend to assume that a narrator is telling the truth, and we can't necessarily assume that. Sometimes narrators do lie. Sometimes they tell us things that are their understanding, but it's not true, right? So, for instance, we've got the unreliable narrator, right? The unreliable narrator is a narrator that is either deceptive, self-deceptive, meaning he or she is lying to him or herself, deluded in some other state of consciousness, or deranged, doesn't know what reality is or what really is true, right? So we can have an unreliable narrator, a narrator that is not necessarily completely honest, may lie intentionally, may lie unintentionally. You see this often in Toni Morrison, for instance, right? Where she's acknowledged her debt to William Faulkner, but Toni Morrison often has narrators that don't exactly tell the whole story, and then we find out later what the real story is, right? Faulkner does the same thing. He started that thing with, Faulkner would change narrators, which was often interesting in his stories. I don't think any of the ones we look at do this. His longer fiction does this, where like a third of the novel will be told through the eyes of one narrator, right? Then a third of the way through, a different narrator takes over, and you realize that first narrator wasn't exactly seeing things the way the second narrator or the third narrator does. So you get kind of a more well-rounded view of a situation when you're hearing a story from multiple people. When you've got one, person or entity relating a story, it's all from that person or that narrator's perspective, right? If you get a story from a few different perspectives, you start to see what the real truth is. Like a police officer taking an accident report, right? The person who rear-ended the car in front of that person will say, well, they slammed on their brakes. That person will say, I didn't slam on my brakes. They were speeding and couldn't stop. You start to, you get the truth in there somewhere. So narrators don't always tell the truth. They can be lying. They can be lying to themselves, to us. They cannot know what reality is. They can be mentally deficient in some way. The other possibility that we have with narrators is that we've got what we would call the innocent or naive narrator, which is another type of unreliable narrator. But the innocent or naive narrator is a character that's often a child or somebody who is intellectually compromised in some way. The innocent or naive narrator, like take a child for instance, right? Children don't always understand exactly what they've witnessed, and then they'll tell a story, and they don't really understand what they saw. Innocent narrators are a lot like that. You get a story, innocent or naive narrators, you get a story that the narrator doesn't realize the significance of. Like, the example I like to use is like, all right, a 5-year-old walks in the room and sees his mom and dad in bed and says, Mom and Dad were dancing in bed. Well, okay, you saw something, you didn't know what you saw, but you're using the tools that you have at your disposal, right, to relate what you saw. So, naive or innocent narrators, often children, they don't quite understand what they've seen or what they're narrating, so, you have to kind of infer a lot with innocent narrators. Stream of consciousness isn't super important. It's just when things are laid out as a writer thinks of them. Then we've got A Rose for Emily. We can, of course, talk about this on our call. I just think a few things about A Rose for Emily that are important. Emily kind of represents this element of Southern culture that refuses to change. She refuses to modernize. She refuses to get a new post box. She refuses to like recognize the world is different. Faulkner really is like commenting on a southern. It's not just a southern mentality, but it is prevalent in the South. Um, I lived in the South for 8 or 10 years, so I've seen it firsthand. That doesn't accept that the Civil War is over. Like, doesn't want to change. Believes that things are going to go back to the way they were, and yeah, it's a little scary. She's a little scary, obviously. So yeah, she represents this world of the South that is gone, but doesn't want to kind of give in. She refuses to change. She refuses to modernize. She meets this guy Homer. We're told that he's not the marrying type. Um, she seems to have some problematic relationships with human beings. Her father is very heavy in her life. He dictates who she can see and who she can't see. He dies in a moment of foreshadowing. She keeps the body for 3 days before she calls the coroners or whatever, right? So she's got this like doesn't want to be abandoned thing, and she feels like keeping the body of the father will keep him with her. So later she gets involved with Homer. He seems to, or she seems to think they're going to be married. He might not understand the same, thing is going on that she thinks. She poisons him and keeps his body and sleeps next to it for years and years and years, right? So some of these stories you're going to be kind of surprised, I think, a little bit by. You're going to think that we're going to be doing something that's a little more humdrum than we really are doing. I mean, we're really delving into, in a lot of these stories, the human condition, madness, love, loss, psychopathy in some of them. Like there are some rather strange stories we'll be looking at, but I'd like to leave these lectures more as a way to talk about the chapters than as a way for me to just share my view of the stories, because I'm really more concerned to hear what you think of the stories and what you think the important things are, right? I don't want to just like tell you what they're about, because this is a process where we're going to learn from each other. I'm going to learn from your writing, you're going to learn from me. That's how we do literature. There's no correct really answer. I mean, of course you can misread something, and if you think A Rose for Emily happened in Alaska, it didn't. It happened in Mississippi, right? So you can be factually incorrect, but literature is about interpretation, and that's what you have to do in the papers. You have to provide interpretations. For instance, this paper about Sonny's Blues. How do these two different characters define success? Please don't just tell me the plot. Well, first the brother's on the subway and he reads about Sonny getting arrested, and then he's teaching his class, and then he sees this guy, and then don't do that, right? That's not what we're doing. A literature paper answers the question it's given by using moments of the text and explaining what they mean. So you have to think about the